In the course of revisiting the Dragon Age games, I felt compelled to write about gay relationships across the series. Initially, I made that exploration with male romances via the Warden and Zevran in Dragon Age Origins, and Hawke and Anders in Dragon Age 2. Exploring the character writing of the BioWare games was, to my mind, easiest when done in the context of the companions who were written explicitly with that sort of player engagement in mind. Equally useful was the draw of the romances to how the player experiences the story. The writing of these games has always been funny and weird and odd at times, but there's so much to care for that, to me, it becomes remarkably profound as art through the sheer depth of the experience. In my replay of Dragon Age Inquisition, I created a male Trevelyan Inquisitor to romance Dorian and explore other elements of the game's writing and design, but I felt like something was missing until I saw some of the social media controversy around transgender inclusion in Dragon Age. This essay isn't about that controversy, we've been there and done that. No, this is about the art itself, about Inquisition, Krem, and being trans in Dragon Age. For the uninitiated, Krem is short for Kremesius, and he is a member of a mercenary group called the Bull's Chargers, which the player may optionally encounter in Dragon Age Inquisition, but most people do. They're located near the first spawn point of the Storm Coast, which is one of the earliest areas available to the player. They're also acquired as part of the quest whereby the player can acquire a fan-favorite character, the Iron Bull. Being the second Qunari companion ever in the series, and the first to be romanceable by the player, Bull's unique appearance and flashy attitude makes him a fan-favorite among Inquisition enthusiasts. He won't be the central point of this essay, so we'll have to discuss the Iron Bull another time, but he is necessary to understand both Krem's backstory and his place in the narrative. The player has the opportunity to get to know Bull and the Chargers a little better over a few drinks in the tavern of the hub area. The player has the opportunity to talk to Krem about a few things here. The most obvious is how Bull and Krem met. Krem was low on the rungs of the social order in Tevinter, a sort of polar opposite of Dorian, but similar in that as a queer person, he wasn't well accepted in terms of how he fit into that society. Just like Dorian, Krem's family wanted him to be someone other than who he was, to marry to keep the family standing. And just like Dorian, Krem's family failed to prevail against the pressures of their larger society, in this instance resorting to slavery instead of blood magic. The difference is that instead of Dorian's father using blood magic as conversion therapy, Krem's father sold himself into slavery, an act that might be considered a kind of self-sacrifice which nevertheless still saw Krem needing to make his own way in the world. When Krem was on the run after masquerading as a soldier Mulan style, Bull saw Krem in trouble and intervened, which is how he lost his eye. Krem seized the opportunity at a little upward mobility and began his life as a mercenary. The Iron Bull only asks one thing of Krem and the Chargers, that they pull their weight in a fight. Krem's a competent soldier, and that's the only thing Bull needs him to be. In a sense, it's a liberating role for Krem. In the course of the conversation, Bull quickly introduces the named members of the group, but Krem, as Bull's sort of second-in-command, does the majority of the talking back, both literally in the sense of written dialogue, and figuratively in the sense that he sasses his commanding officer. Bull is quick to point out that the Qun, the religious social order that regulates Qunari society, would discipline Krem for this pretty hard. However, the way he says this is as an addendum. His original point is that under the Qun, Krem would be something called a Qun Ethlok, meaning someone born into one gender role, but operating in another. Unlike broader human society, this group, despite being roughly analogous to transgender individuals, are not generally mistreated. Players who have experienced the story and character interactions of Dragon Age Origins will know that this is not in spite of, but actually because of the Qun's strict gender roles. In the first game, the only prior Qunari companion, Sten, is surprised to meet women who fight. His assumption had been that only men fight, because that is how the Qun operates. As Bull tells it, this is accurate. In context, Sten's confusion makes sense. One would think he would notice the discrepancy quickly, but this is explained by how when he looked at the gender roles of his companions, he looked first at the fighters and worked backwards from there. As opposed to gender being, for the Qunari, a restriction of roles based on assigned sex, Sten's assumption was that the role dictated the gender, so if one is a fighter, one is a man. This being a subject of friction for the first game makes the interactions between Bull and Krem a little more meaningful, but it also creates a powerful moment in a quest that occurs later on. For a human transgender character rebelling against human social prejudice, doing so is an act of humanization. They are pursuing their own identity as an individual, which is a liberatory act, and their own security within the group, which is an equalizing act. Krem's pursuit of his lifestyle scans dually in the human context of the game as this sort of act. Later developments challenge this idea. The broad strokes of the quest involving the Iron Bull are that the player ends up taking him on a lot of fun missions, and he has a lot of input, but his arc in the base game comes down, finally, to a quest where the Inquisition courts the Qun. The Qunari and the Inquisition team up to fight the minions of Corypheus, the game's chief antagonist, and in the process the player has to make a hard choice. A Qunari dreadnought is closing on the vulnerable enemy position, but its path is only kept clear by two hills held on the one hand by the Inquisitor, their party, Bull and the Qunari, and on the other hand by members of the Chargers. The enemy attempts to retake the hill held by the Chargers. The player can order Bull to call a retreat for the Chargers, losing the hill and sacrificing the dreadnought along with any future Qunari alliance, or the player can order Bull to stand fast and allow the Chargers to be killed so the dreadnought is free to engage. The effect this choice has on Bull is more pronounced in the Trespasser DLC, where he will aid the Qun by betraying the player, and instead of calling the Inquisitor boss, as usual, he subtly calls them boss, or thing, in Qunlot. The Iron Bull as a character has more on the line in this quest than players will guess. It's not just their relationship and his life that are at stake in Trespasser, but more crucially his personhood and his ability to value the personhood of others. Krem was a person. All the Chargers were. In sacrificing them for the cause, the Inquisitor implicitly teaches Bull what people are, reminding him that we as individuals are tools under the Qun, and while there is security in equality, without individuality there is no liberty. When the Qun comes into conflict with the Inquisition, the Iron Bull chooses the Qun regardless of whether he must kill his friend or die an otherwise meaningless death. But if the player should spare Krem and the Chargers, then the Iron Bull learns the opposite lesson. He learns to value personhood, a temptation already present in his protest that the Chargers are his men when sacrificing them is proposed. He values who they are as individuals beyond their usefulness to the Qun, and continues to do so unless the Inquisitor takes that away from him. The ability of a person like Krem to be born into one gender role but live as another under the Qun might sound liberating, and depending on how you think about it, maybe it is. But like many strict religions, ideologies, and social orders, that's only the case so long as the Qun and one's personhood are not in conflict. When personal sacrifice is required, when a person becomes a tool, then implicitly, ideologically, from the Qun's perspective, the Inquisitor becomes a boss, a thing, and likewise so too are Bull and Krem things to be used. In that light, the Qun's relative acceptance of some equivalent of transgender individuals is, to the Qun, not a bug but a feature. Where being transgender serves the needs, ideals, and functions of the Qun, then it is accepted. Otherwise it is irrelevant, even in death. In this way, the Qun is not too dissimilar from many real-world ideologies. A Qun are accepted because they serve, they are useful tools. But Krem is a person. If he dies, it's not the Qun precisely that remembers him. His empty chair sits in the corner of the tavern at Skyhold. The Inquisitor walks past it by the door, and it is the Iron Bull that remembers. The game seems to want to ask the player what they will choose to teach Bull about loss, personhood, and duty. When I first set out to write about this quest, the Iron Bull and Inquisition, that was where I wanted to leave things, and one day we'll return to this for a more Bull-centric perspective. But somehow it feels wrong to write about Krem and make it about Bull, even though in the context of the game, Krem does function in many ways as an extension of the Iron Bull. It is precisely because Krem is a person that the annihilation of the Chargers means his story ends here. He never gets to see the end of Corypheus, the triumph of the Inquisition, the betrayal of the Dreadwolf, and any other subsequent events. He doesn't get to be a part of it anymore. His chair sits empty. His absence is felt every time the player enters the tavern in a small but unnerving way. I tend to avoid sacrificing the Chargers for that reason. It's just too sad. But there is another reason. I have to stress how personal this is to me, and that every person who plays Inquisition will, like the Dragon Age games in general, and the BioWare role-playing games beyond that, get something wildly different out of it. For me, this is a part of what I get out of it, one of many little things. The truth is that people die every day. Soldiers die fighting in battles, ordinary people die for their convictions, and marginalized people are persecuted. In the grand scheme of things, Krem's death doesn't change much, but the reason Bull changes is because he doesn't forget, and neither can I. A dead body is a thing that was once a person. A person has to die to become a thing. The Iron Bull's subtle dialogue in the Trespasser DLC hints that because he lost Krem and the Chargers, he lost the ability to not see people as things. His protest that the Chargers were his men makes more sense in this light. Without using as many words, he's arguing for their humanity. I used a contentious framing earlier in this essay. I'm well aware that the framing of liberty and equity is simplistic and therefore doesn't capture the whole picture. I know that not all issues of the humanization of oppressed groups are reducible simply to identity and security. In fact, thinking in all those terms brings with them their own conceits that color how we engage with these topics. Naturally, that's completely true, and it will probably have occurred to some people. I used that framing here for another reason. I often see discourses about humanization and marginalization reduced to a dynamic I see with extreme dissatisfaction. People will pontificate on the necessity of either individualism or collectivism and the dangers of their opposites. You will hear people say that we live in an individualistic culture, or that other alternative cultures are more collectivist, or that some ideologies are individualistic or collectivistic and therefore dangerous to our freedoms. I hate this framing with all my heart. Words like these can be useful to navigating our feelings on complicated topics, but they can also be detrimental. My desire to invoke this framing for the sake of commentary is exactly why I deployed that language earlier in this essay. Without the group, the society, the human being is not a human being. They do not become conditioned to our cognition and what we sometimes call higher thought, without their requisite social interaction with other similar human beings. In much the same way, without these individuals, these finite beings, there is no society, only emptiness occupied variably and imperceptibly. In the absence of human beings to perceive them, there would be no art, no social expression or social relations at all. We find ourselves through our individual selves and through our collective selves. These are not totally extricable from one another. When I hear in social circles which cross over with my own, that the problem with society for marginalized people is that we are too individualistic, especially with relevance to systems of domination and oppression, I reject this notion entirely. People on such social margins, a spatially related figure of speech for someone whose needs, desires, and personhood are implicitly deprioritized from society by virtue of how society is constructed, are experiencing something that at once prepares them to die and prepares others to kill them, even without active negative animus or bigotry. A deprioritization of personhood is a deprioritization of life. Death makes a person into a thing. Marginalized people do not require collectivism, nor do they require individualism. They require a reorientation of their position within society as individuals, which is to say that they need a change that marries the two concepts. If they want to demand their entitlement to this reorientation, they need a life-affirming gesture, something like a moral demand for justice. They cannot achieve this alone as isolated actors on the social margins, because this restriction only affirms their disadvantaged position. They cannot achieve this by expecting those comparably advantaged individuals or groups to condescend to them or embrace them, not merely because they would be waiting for many such privileged persons to act in favor of one self-interest against another self-interest, which leaves too much to personal whim, but also because to do so would be an affirmation of their submission as individuals. A more fully human person is both one's equal and a free participant. That is what it means to be humanized. In the case of Krem, I choose life. This is not exclusively because there is some sense in which he reminds me of myself or in which I feel sorry for him. It is rather a kind of ritual I express through the game's questline. I feel personally like the opportunity to prioritize Krem's life is also an opportunity to humanize him against all the ways in which he and real people like him are dehumanized. I want him to be a person. The value of this humanization, I think, is evident in his continued relationship with the Iron Bull, and the way that relationship enables him to also choose life, as he too must retain his personhood to survive. I want to survive, and so I must be a person.